In my years of analytical practice, I have observed a phenomenon that troubles me greatly. Individuals, often of considerable intelligence and good intention, undertake what they believe to be a confrontation with their shadow, only to find themselves overwhelmed by forces they were unprepared to meet. These are not the weak-minded or the unstable, but rather those who possess sufficient sensitivity to perceive the deeper currents of the psyche, yet lack the psychological foundation necessary to withstand what they encounter there. The tragedy of such cases lies not in their failure, but in their premature attempt at what is perhaps the most demanding task of human development, the integration of the shadow. I have witnessed brilliant minds shattered by their encounter with aspects of themselves they believed they could simply overcome through will or spiritual practice. The consulting room has shown me repeatedly that the path to individuation cannot be rushed, and those who attempt to bypass the necessary preparatory work often find themselves victims of the very forces they sought to master. The shadow, as I have come to understand it through decades of clinical observation, represents those aspects of the personality that the conscious ego finds incompatible with its chosen identity. It is not merely the repository of moral failings or primitive impulses, though these certainly form part of its contents. Rather, the shadow encompasses all those potentials, positive and negative alike, that have been rejected by the conscious attitude in service of maintaining a coherent sense of self. Consider the case of a young man who came to me following what he described as a spiritual crisis. He had been practicing meditation and studying Eastern philosophy with considerable dedication, seeking what he termed enlightenment. In his earnest pursuit of spiritual purity, he had attempted to eliminate from his consciousness all thoughts and impulses he deemed unworthy. The result was not the transcendence he sought, but a psychological inflation followed by a devastating collapse. The shadow, denied its rightful place in the psychic economy, had taken its revenge through a series of compulsive behaviors that contradicted everything he consciously valued. This phenomenon illustrates a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of psychological development. The shadow is not an enemy to be conquered, but a necessary component of the complete personality. Its contents represent not only our rejected potentials, but also our unrealized vitality. To attempt its elimination is to wage war against the very forces that provide depth and authenticity to human existence. The shadow manifests in both personal and collective dimensions, and any serious attempt at psychological development must acknowledge this dual nature. On the personal level, the shadow consists of those aspects of our individual history and temperament that have been sacrificed to the demands of social adaptation. Every persona we construct, every role we adopt in society necessarily excludes certain potentials that then retreat into the unconscious, where they continue to exert their influence through indirect means. Yet the shadow extends beyond the merely personal into the realm of the collective unconscious. Here we encounter not only our individual rejected contents, but also the accumulated shadow of our cultural and ancestral heritage. The Germanic tradition speaks of the doppelganger, that dark double that accompanies each individual through life. This is not mere folklore, but a profound psychological insight into the compensatory nature of the unconscious. In my clinical work, I have observed that those who approach spiritual development without acknowledging this collective dimension often find themselves overwhelmed by contents that seem to emerge from beyond their personal experience. They encounter what appears to be pure evil or destructive force, not recognizing that they have stumbled into the collective shadow of humanity itself. Without proper preparation and understanding, such encounters can indeed lead to psychological disintegration. The Christian tradition recognizes this danger in its concept of the dark night of the soul, a period of spiritual trial that tests the seeker's readiness for deeper realization. Yet too often, modern seekers attempt to bypass such trials through technique or will, not understanding that the darkness serves an essential function in psychological development. The shadow, both personal and collective, acts as a guardian at the threshold, ensuring that only those with sufficient psychological stability can proceed safely into the deeper mysteries of the psyche. The relationship between persona and shadow is complementary rather than antagonistic. The persona, our chosen face toward the world, requires the shadow as its necessary opposite. Without this tension, the personality becomes one-sided and loses its dynamic quality. I have seen individuals who have so identified with their spiritual persona that they become rigid and lifeless, cut off from the very sources of energy and creativity that originally drew them to spiritual seeking. The compensatory function of the unconscious ensures that whatever is excluded from consciousness will seek expression through other means. The more rigidly one maintains a spiritual identity, the more powerfully the shadow will assert itself. This is not a design flaw in the psyche, but rather its wisdom in maintaining psychological balance. The unconscious serves life, not our conscious ideals, and it will sacrifice our spiritual pretensions to preserve the wholeness of the personality. Individuation, the central task of human development, represents the gradual differentiation of the self from the collective influences that shape early life. This process cannot be accomplished through will or technique, but requires a careful and patient engagement with the unconscious over many years. Those who attempt to accelerate this process through intensive spiritual practices often trigger psychological crises they are unprepared to manage. The danger lies in mistaking temporary states of consciousness for permanent achievement. I have encountered numerous individuals who, through meditation or other practices, have touched what they believe to be enlightened awareness, only to find themselves subsequently overwhelmed by shadow contents they thought they had transcended. Such experiences often lead to spiritual inflation, a condition in which the ego identifies with archetypal contents and loses touch with its human limitations. The alchemical tradition, which I have studied extensively, provides valuable insights into this process through its symbolism of the nigredo, the dark phase of transformation that must precede any genuine renewal. The medieval alchemists understood that dissolution must precede coagulation, that the old form must die before the new can emerge. Modern seekers, however, often attempt to bypass this necessary death and rebirth, seeking only the light while avoiding the darkness. True individuation requires what I term a strong ego complex, a stable sense of personal identity that can withstand the encounters with the unconscious. Those who begin spiritual work with weak ego development often find themselves overwhelmed by archetypal contents that they lack the psychological resources to integrate. This is particularly dangerous in our modern era, where traditional structures of meaning have weakened and individuals often turn to spiritual seeking as a means of finding identity rather than transforming an already established one. The role of suffering in psychological development cannot be overlooked. Genuine transformation requires the acceptance of psychological pain as the price of consciousness. Those who seek spirituality as an escape from suffering often find themselves unprepared for the deeper sufferings that individuation entails. The integration of the shadow necessarily involves confronting aspects of ourselves that we find disturbing or unacceptable, and this confrontation cannot be accomplished without considerable psychological distress. I have observed that the second half of life presents natural opportunities for individuation that are absent in youth. The disappointments and limitations that accumulate over time serve to humble the ego and prepare it for more realistic self-assessment. Young people who attempt advanced spiritual work often lack this natural preparation and may find themselves attempting tasks for which they are psychologically unprepared. The modern emphasis on technique and method in spiritual development often obscures the essentially personal and relational nature of individuation. No amount of meditation or spiritual practice can substitute for the patient work of understanding one's own psychological patterns and their historical development. The unconscious reveals itself through relationship and conflict, not through withdrawal from life into artificial states of consciousness. The phenomenon of individual shadow projection finds its most dangerous expression in collective movements, where entire groups project their rejected contents onto others. My observations during the recent war years have shown how easily civilized people can become possessed by collective shadow contents, leading to behaviors that would be unthinkable under normal circumstances. The individual who attempts shadow work without understanding its collective dimensions often finds themselves overwhelmed by contents that extend far beyond their personal experience. They may encounter what appears to be pure evil or destructive force, not recognizing that they have contacted the collective shadow of humanity itself. Without proper preparation and context, such encounters can lead to identification with archetypal contents and subsequent psychological inflation or deflation. The projection of collective shadow onto other nations or groups serves a psychological function for the collective, allowing it to maintain its positive self-image by externalizing its rejected contents. Yet for the individual engaged in serious psychological work, such projections become increasingly difficult to maintain. As one becomes more conscious of one's own shadow, the projections onto others begin to withdraw, often leaving the individual feeling isolated from their cultural group. This isolation represents one of the genuine perils of individuation. As consciousness expands, the individual often finds themselves at odds with collective values and assumptions. They can no longer participate unconsciously in the group's projections and may find themselves bearing the weight of psychological contents that the collective prefers to keep unconscious. This burden can be overwhelming for those who lack adequate preparation or support. The responsibility of the individual in relation to collective unconscious forces cannot be understated. Those who achieve some degree of shadow integration bear a moral obligation to serve not only their own development, but the welfare of the collective. Yet this responsibility itself can become a source of inflation if not approached with proper humility and understanding. The scapegoat mechanism, whereby groups project their collective shadow onto designated victims, represents one of humanity's most persistent and dangerous patterns. The individual who has begun to withdraw projections may find themselves either serving as scapegoats for others or struggling with the temptation to project their own unintegrated contents onto convenient targets. The path of individuation requires the courage to bear one's own shadow rather than seeking relief through projection. Historical examples abound of individuals who, having touched deeper levels of consciousness, become identified with messianic or prophetic roles. Such identification represents a dangerous confusion between personal development and collective mission. The unconscious may indeed present archetypal contents related to service or leadership, but these must be approached with the utmost caution and discrimination. The necessity of proper psychological preparation cannot be overemphasized. Shadow work is not a technique to be learned from books or workshops, but a gradual process of relationship with the unconscious that unfolds over many years. Those who approach it as a method to be mastered often find themselves unprepared for the ethical and psychological demands it presents. The role of the analyst in shadow confrontation serves not to eliminate the shadow, but to provide a container within which it can be encountered safely. The analytical relationship offers a space where projections can be experienced and gradually withdrawn without the devastating consequences that might result from such encounters in ordinary life. This is why self-analysis has such severe limitations. The unconscious requires relationship for its revelation. The importance of gradual approach cannot be overstated. The psyche has its own wisdom about timing and readiness, and attempts to force premature development often result in psychological crisis rather than genuine growth. I have learned to trust the unconscious process rather than the conscious will in determining the pace of analytical work. Patients often express frustration with this gradual approach, preferring dramatic breakthroughs to the patient work of relationship and understanding. The moral implications of shadow integration extend beyond personal development to encompass one's relationships and responsibilities in the world. Integration does not mean acting out shadow impulses, but rather developing a conscious relationship with them that allows for ethical choice rather than unconscious compulsion. This distinction is crucial and often misunderstood by those who mistake integration for license. The difference between acting out shadow impulses and integrating them represents perhaps the most critical distinction in all of analytical psychology. Integration involves developing a conscious relationship with shadow contents while maintaining ethical responsibility for one's actions. Acting out, by contrast, represents possession by shadow contents and typically leads to behavior that damages both oneself and others. The lifelong nature of the individuation process means that there are no final achievements or permanent states of enlightenment. Each stage of life presents new challenges and opportunities for development, and the shadow continues to evolve as consciousness expands. Those who believe they have completed the work of integration often find themselves confronted by new and unexpected aspects of their unconscious. The importance of maintaining connection to collective values while individuating presents an ongoing challenge. Complete withdrawal from collective life represents a form of psychological inflation, while unconscious participation in collective projections represents a failure to take responsibility for one's own development. The path requires a careful balance between individual authenticity and social responsibility. Why there are no shortcuts or techniques for genuine psychological development becomes clear when we understand that individuation is not a goal to be achieved, but a way of living in relationship with the unconscious. It requires the development of what I term a religious attitude toward life, a recognition that the psyche contains mysteries that exceed our conscious understanding and control. The ethical responsibility that comes with shadow awareness extends far beyond personal comfort or even individual fulfillment. Those who undertake serious psychological work bear an obligation to serve not only their own development but the welfare of humanity itself. This is not a burden to be undertaken lightly, nor can it be fulfilled through good intentions alone. The relationship between individual wholeness and cultural renewal represents one of the most profound aspects of analytical psychology. As individuals become more conscious of their own shadow contents and withdraw their projections, they contribute to the gradual healing of collective wounds. Yet this process requires generations rather than years, and those who participate in it may not live to see its fruits. My hopes for future generations rest upon their ability to approach psychological development with the seriousness and patience it demands. The modern tendency toward quick solutions and immediate gratification represents a significant obstacle to genuine individuation, yet I have also observed an increasing awareness among thoughtful individuals of the need for deeper psychological understanding, particularly in light of the destructive potentials that have been revealed in our recent history. The ultimate purpose of psychological development must serve life itself rather than personal aggrandizement or even individual happiness. The unconscious serves the whole of life, not merely human consciousness, and our development must align with this larger purpose if it is to have genuine meaning. This requires a fundamental shift in attitude from taking from life to serving life, from demanding fulfillment to accepting responsibility. The concerns I hold for those who would undertake this work stem not from any desire to discourage serious seekers, but from the recognition that premature or misguided attempts at shadow confrontation can result in psychological damage that may require years to heal. The path of individuation is not for everyone, nor should it be. Many individuals serve life best through conscious participation in collective values rather than through the dangerous work of individual development. Yet for those who are called to this path, either through temperament or circumstance, the work remains essential. The increasing complexity of modern life requires individuals who can bear the tension of psychological opposites without splitting into unconscious extremes. The fate of our civilization may well depend upon the emergence of such individuals who can hold the middle ground between competing forces and serve as bridges between different ways of being. In closing, I must emphasize that the observations presented here emerge from my limited perspective as one man's encounter with the depths of the human psyche. The mysteries we touch in analytical work exceed any individual's capacity for complete understanding. What I offer is not dogma but hypothesis, based upon careful observation and sustained reflection upon the phenomena that have presented themselves in my consulting room and in my own psychological development. The shadow will continue to take its revenge upon those who approach it with insufficient preparation or respect. Yet for those who can bear the uncertainty and difficulty of genuine relationship with the unconscious, the rewards extend far beyond personal satisfaction to encompass participation in the ongoing creation of human consciousness itself. This is work worthy of our highest efforts and deepest commitment, even as it demands the humility to recognize that we serve forces greater than our individual understanding.